And I think it's something that people on the left have talked about in relation to mental health for a long time. So maybe you can just talk a little bit more about how collective action and protests and activism can be good for your mental
Hmm.
health.
Yeah, okay. Well, again, a thing that, as they would say in the academic world, it's under-theorized, as in there's not an awful lot written about it and not an awful lot studied about it. But for the very reasons I was kind of referring to earlier, this is not terribly surprising. Marx wrote years ago that the ruling class, they control not just the means of production of kind of material things, tables and chairs and food and stuff, but they also control the means of mental production. So, you know, the publication of books and newspapers and so on, and to still a large extent, despite our hopes and dreams, they still largely control the internet, and part of the dominant kind of discourse at the moment, what is coming from the center is trying to discredit those parts of information sharing that come from the masses rather than the elite. So not written, and probably won't be written, except on the left. There's some good things, some really good things being written about policing at the moment that are very interesting. And it may be no harm to start there in terms of collective action right now. There's probably no better example than Black Lives Matter. And I say that not just because it's on all the airwaves and it's big news, but as to why it's big news. It's big news because it is an uprising against the central state authority. I mean, a state, as Lenin and Engels described it many years ago, is just a body of armed men. And the body of armed men of the number one imperial state is usually the strongest body of armed men and women in the world. And in the United States, the poorest section and the most discriminated and oppressed section, as in African Americans, have taken to the streets to say, yeah, it's not okay to shoot us, as a re-emergence of a movement that started in 2013 and really was a continuation of the movements of the 60s for civil rights that literally sparked the last great uprising in the United States, which was in the late 60s and early 70s, and had many equivalents around the world, Paris in 68 and so on. So Black Lives Matter matters because, number one, imperial state, and you're confronting actually the frontline workers, the front line of the state. And they are the most heavily armed. They are largely armed in a way which most police would not be armed. Police armed in the way that street cops are armed in the United States would generally be referred to as paramilitary police, or would just be a section of the army. They are carrying automatic assault weapons. They are carrying all manner of what they're calling less lethal weapons. And of course, we know from our history here in Northern Ireland that these non-lethal weapons, if fired at close range, are very lethal indeed. And quite a few people have lost limbs, eyes, and been killed by them. But this collective action, this uprising, in the midst, as I say, of a pandemic, which not alone was there large-scale support for social distancing and social restrictions, but there was particularly as well among the African American community themselves, because they're more heavily affected by it. A lot of evidence that because of poorer health, things like diabetes and so on, African Americans were dying in way greater numbers, as were Latinos, because poverty in the United States is racialized, and we know that poverty is a big, is the main cause of long-term illness, and that was affecting African Americans more than most. Also, as we were talking earlier, the economic effects: losing your job, cutting back your hours, becoming fearful of not being able to pay rent and buy food and so on. That was affecting African Americans more than most other groups. Even on the day that Trump tried to relate to the central figure whose murder, whose lynching led to the uprising, George Floyd, was a day in which employment figures had gone up, but the word that Trump used was George Floyd would be looking down and saying that's a good thing. And he names equality because, you know, this is equality. And on that day, employment had fallen, but it actually had gone up for the African American community. So even even when Trump is trying to concede, he still gets it wrong. But the point, I think, of that uprising is manifold, and you can see it. Again, you can see it in social media. Depends what you're able to access. I'm a big fan of Democracy Now!, the news station, if you want to see some good interviews, some good footage. But you will see loads of clips of African Americans speaking to camera in a way that shows confidence, shows spirit, it shows bravery that literally humbles me. It makes me emotional. Some of the things that have been said to camera, Tamika Mallory was, I think, one of the first ones I had sent to me. And it was like seeing the reincarnation of Martin Luther King, but with more attitude. It was a better speech. You know, his I Have a Dream speech is now paling into insignificance compared to what ordinary people are saying to camera that's been put up on YouTube, on the internet. And, you know, this movement of people together, of the most oppressed group in the United States, is improving their morale, is improving their self-respect, you know, is improving their sense of self-worth, but also their connection to others. And what is wonderful about it this time, I mean, in the civil rights explosion of the 1960s, there was the best part of 100 years of Jim Crow, the kind of segregation, South Africa-like apartheid laws. But this time, I do think the uprising is way more targeted on the central authority of the state and has allowed for a lot more solidarity. There was solidarity. There were white students and so on who helped to run registration drives for voting back in the 60s. Solidarity is not new, but it does appear to be a much greater mass phenomenon. I've read figures of solidarity with Black Lives Matter of, you know, high 60s, low 70%. I mean, I'm looking at that going, I mean, some Republicans agree with this. So the level of solidarity is fantastic. I think what Black Lives Matter demonstrate is not just the taking action, you know, not just getting out of your house, but being with others, sharing your hopes and dreams, like actually physically saying them out loud, making your sign, holding it up, being together is good for you. But it's good for the rest of us, you know. I mean, Black Lives Matter is not. I'm just being personal because I think we're all so isolated now. Maybe I'm allowed to indulge, but it has improved my mental health to see Black Lives Matter on the screen. It has not made me feel as I have felt before when you see an oppressed people shot down and bludgeoned. It makes you feel a sadness for them, a solidarity that you know, you wish to join up and fight back with them if you could, or in any way you could. But to look at them with admiration, to look at them as figures that you might emulate or wish to emulate, to see a bunch of people take on the most heavily armed state in the world together and say some of the most inspiring things I have ever heard. And, you know, I'm not saying this just to be wishful and say, don't worry, people who are afraid of coronavirus, there's some silver lining on the cloud. I just literally have not seen this level of coordination happen so quickly and take on just powers that only months ago looked literally unimpeachable. If you go back to, say, last winter and ask an average handful of people about Trump, there would be a lot who would go, oh, he's going to be re-elected. You know, not that they thought that was a certainty, that they had a full grasp of the material reasons, but they felt a pessimism that there was little you could do about authorities such as Trump, no matter how buffoonish, idiotic, unscientific, you know, downright mean, vengeful, right-wing, white supremacist and fascist they might be, that there was little you could do about it. Now, that leads me full circle, and I will finish on this, to why is collective, you know, better than individual? Because it has a hope of changing the thing that is making you feel bad. Most mainstream approaches to mental health are saying there's a bad thing. There's lots of bad things. Some of them will always be with us. People we love dying and getting sick and dying. That'll always be with us. And, you know, we'll always have to have ways of coping with that. And they will develop, and, you know, we will develop culturally to deal with them. But there are things that don't have to happen. There are things that are preventable. You know, wars, famines, and this pandemic, about which there's been very, very little debate. This pandemic was caused by capitalist agriculture. It was caused by a failure of health systems to have early warning systems and to be prepared at a public health level to deal with epidemics. Even though they got regular warnings every couple of years, they still weren't ready. And it was a failure of capacity in terms of having the protective equipment, to have the monitoring systems, the places of highest risk, because early on the Chinese told us way back in January, health workers, the elderly and people with chronic ill health are the people who are more likely to die. So they're the high risk people. And we abandoned nursing homes, which contain health workers, older people, and people who have chronic ill health, because that's why a lot of people are in a nursing home as opposed to living out their old age at home, and literally abandoned them. And almost not a question. I mean, a lot of people have expressed outrage, and we don't all want to go in a blamey place, because we're all still trying to, you know, emphasize cooperation to beat off this damn thing, because it is a killer and so on. But it is, again, that failure to address the more social aspects of physical health are also blight mental health. And I think the ideological component, i.e. the component that our rulers would like us to believe to keep us from, you know, doing anything about it, like getting rid of them, is that you can't. There's no point trying. And in fact, trying to affect a change on the thing that's stressing you is almost a sign of insanity. Now, it's again things like that that collective actions break. So to take part in them makes you feel better. It connects you. It allows you to give vent. But, and this is where it's too soon to say, where will Black Lives Matter go? Minneapolis City Council has called for the defunding of the police. Now, one fascinating element of this proposal is that what some people have drawn attention to is not just, oh, what do we do without the police? Because the police are fairly useless when it comes to the central thing that most people think that they're involved with, which is crime prevention, which they're utterly useless at. But has drawn attention to what the police are very often called to, which are domestic violence, rape cases, and mental health crises. In fact, a mental health crisis is quite a likely foundation for why American civilians are shot by the police, because it's the police that are called. Now, if that person having a mental health crisis also happens to be a person of color, then they're even more likely to be shot. But the call out. So what people are drawing attention to is, why are we calling the police out to them? And when you defund them, that means you have money now to spend on stuff. So why don't we spend that stuff on actual crime prevention which mainly has to do with improving the social infrastructure in your community. Responses to domestic violence, such as having, I found out last week that Dún Laoghaire, population 220,000, has not got one women's refuge. Not one. I mean, you don't know where to start with some of that stuff. But also the response to assault, physical assault, and particularly sexual assault is grossly underfunded. Often mishandled by the police, often the victims of sexual violence are abused by the police, often the perpetrators of sexual violence are the police themselves. But in any case, it is really unquestionable that police as such are not an appropriate first line contact. They are not frontline workers in these areas that that literally is often the only place that if you ring the emergency number 911 in America or 999 here, you will be directed to the police for things that really they have neither the skill, the ability, nor the desire to deal with. So there could be loads more funding for community operations that deal with poverty and inequality, for organizations that deal with domestic violence and sexual abuse. And most importantly, the message that's coming out of this is not just we don't need the police and there are other public services we do need, but that in order truly to deal with poverty and inequality, we need to be able to control more than just the city council. I think back to the Labour theory of value, people are starting to ask the question more and more, what do we need and how is that made? And I think attention to what is made that we don't need, like, munitions, landmines. If you had a vote on landmines in the morning, I don't think it would get much support. So it is drawing up and I think that the final connection I'll make is the connection between individual control, which is very important. If you feel out of control, it's not a nice place to be. You like to feel in a certain amount of control within realistic levels. I'll go out there in the world and, it's not going to all fall in on me. I'll have a chance to have a decent day. And social control. These are connected. And at the moment, one of the walls I think we have to break down the most vociferously is the division between individual and collective control. We need individual, we need a feeling of individual control, but we get that a lot from how much social control there actually is in the true sense, not being socially controlled by a small social agent, a minority, but how much social control the majority of us have, which means that, whether it's Black Lives Matter or shop workers going for a pay rise, renationalizing the health service, which is still a mess, all of these things become crucially important. If you look at the programme for government, there's almost nothing, vague waffle on all of these things, an utter commitment to reprivatize the health service. So if we're asking what lessons we're learning, certainly the government just wants to go back to the way things were. And I think that's the lesson for all of us is, yes, there could be some hits to our mental health. Let's not forget there have been some positives to mental health in all of this, whether through cooperation, more time doing things that are better for your quality of life than the workplace. But all of those are now challenged again, removing welfare payments, reprivatizing the health service and so on. We're not in a bad position to go on to really take from the collective example of Black Lives Matter, because I think increasingly that's why that's important. There is racism in Ireland. We absolutely should use that as an example against racist attacks, racist discrimination in schools and workplaces, in the street, in your locality, and also direct provision. But we should just take the general message. There is no state big enough and strong enough that we cannot stand up together and call for justice, but also look for control. And that's the best improvement I think our mental health could receive.